In the third week of May 1945, investigators from the American Strategic Bombing Survey arrived at Glücksburg Castle in northern Germany to question the most cooperative prisoner of the entire war. Over the next week, Albert Speer walked them through how the Reich's war economy had really worked, the factories, the statistics, the production surge that carried his name. He was so eager to help that he handed them the keys and the safe combination to his private reports to Hitler, locked away in Munich. Out of those sessions came a story that has shaped every argument about the German war economy since. That Germany fought the first half of the war half asleep and only woke up when Speer took command in 1942. If that story is true, there's a lever sitting somewhere in 1939 that nobody pulled. A Germany that goes all in from the first day fights a very different war. So let's pull it and find out what the man in the castle was actually selling. The first thing that changes is the sky over Kent in August 1940. The Battle of Britain came down to margins. Fighter command short of trained pilots, Hugh Dowding rationing his reserves like a man counting cartridges. Now, hand the Luftwaffe a third more fighters from factories that went to war footing a year early. Every raid gets a bigger escort, every British squadron bleeds faster, and the pilot shortage of British legend becomes a pilot famine. Move to the Atlantic and the case gets stronger because Britain was an island that imported most of what it ate, and the submarine force facing it was tiny. A Germany that spent 1939 building U-boats instead of promising itself battleships puts a rope around those sea lanes while the Royal Navy is still hunting submarines with methods from the last war. And on land, fresher and fuller panzer divisions in May 1940 might quiet some of the anxieties behind the famous halt order outside Dunkirk. Maybe the evacuation is smaller. Maybe tens of thousands more men never reach the boats. What it doesn't do is close the pocket on all 300,000, because the halt was never a shortage of tanks. It was commanders worried about exhausted crews, open flanks, and the campaign still to come. String those together, and here's the world you get. Britain suffocating, no Western Front, the whole weight of the Wehrmacht free to turn east. Every piece of it runs on one assumption, that Germany had slack. Idle factories, unspent money, a workforce waiting by the door. That assumption is where the story starts to come apart. Walk through the Germany of 1938, and 1 Reichsmark in every 5 moving through the economy was headed to the military. Enough money to have funded the largest housing program in German history, at a level no capitalist country had ever sustained outside an actual war. Steel had been rationed since 1937, with the Army, Navy and Air Force knifing each other over every allocation. Foreign currency was so scarce that rubber, copper and iron ore imports were managed crisis by crisis. And the famous reserve of labour waiting at home is mostly a myth. By 1939, just over half of German women between 15 and 60 were already working, compared with 1 in 4 in Britain. Britain clawed its way to 4 in 10 by 1944 and never caught up. The propaganda posters showed the German woman in her kitchen. The census showed her running the farm that fed the army. If you've seen our video on how a bankrupt Germany paid for rearmament, you already know what happened to the Volkswagen savers. 275 million Reichsmarks paid in for a people's car that was never delivered to a single civilian, from a factory that built military vehicles instead. In that video, the Volkswagen was evidence of theft. Here, it's evidence of something else. The flagship consumer product of the Reich was already a weapons plant, and it was a weapons plant years before Albert Speer had anything to do with it. Meanwhile, the country Germany was supposed to outproduce was just getting started. In September, the month the battle peaked, British factories turned out 467 fighters. German factories turned out 218, under half. Luftwaffe intelligence had credited the British with 300 at the absolute ceiling. They weren't just wrong about the number. They were wrong about the direction. The year after, Britain built nearly 2 aircraft for every German one. So, what was actually left to squeeze in 1939? Consumer factories were still running. Skilled men still held deferments that kept them out of uniform. The regime was deliberately keeping the war off the German kitchen table. There was room in there. What nobody arguing this scenario ever does is price it. So we pull the lever, and Germany pays for everything it gets. Say Berlin makes the total war decision in the first week of September 1939. A factory approved that Autumn spends 1940 as a construction site and 1941 being tooled and staffed, and delivers its first serious output in 1942. Germany's own flagship programs prove the lag. The Junkers 88 bomber program, planned in 1938, swallowed more than half of the country's entire airframe workforce and still took years to pay off. Hold that delivery date. It's going to matter. Now, test the premise against the record, because we have a controlled experiment. Between the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany ran a war economy at war pitch for a full year. That year bought fewer than 1,000 additional tanks over the force that attacked France. The factories were running flat out, the priorities were lurching. The moment Paris fell, Berlin cut army orders and swung production toward aircraft and U-boats for the war against Britain, then swung it back when the target changed to Moscow. A leadership behaving as if the war was already won is the one thing no mobilization decree can fix, because the decree would have been signed by the same men. And every machine the scenario adds arrives with a thirst. A single panzer division on the move burned about 48,000 gallons of gasoline for every 60 miles it advanced. In France, on good roads. In Russia, the same fuel ration bought barely 40 miles, and in its first year in the East, the army burned 330,000 tons of fuel a month against a plan of 250,000 drawn from reserves that were never deep. Give this army more tanks in 1941 and you don't move the fuel wall. You reach it sooner. The plants that brewed Germany's gasoline out of coal took half a decade to build, and no decree makes them pour faster. The machine could give more, and the man running it had his own reason never to ask. Hitler had named that reason his entire career, November 1918. He believed the last war was lost when the home front cracked, the strikes, the hunger, the revolution that toppled the Kaiser, while the army, as Hitler told it, still stood unbeaten in the field. The regime was built to make sure it never happened again, so the squeeze stayed carefully below the threshold of despair. And a squeeze did exist, whatever the post-war economists concluded from Speer's testimony. Food was rationed in the first week of the war. Clothing followed in November. In the coal crisis of that first winter, German households were allowed warm water twice a week, and by 1941, per-person food consumption had fallen by roughly a quarter. What Berlin refused was the full version, and conquest is what let it refuse. Occupied Europe could be looted, its food shipped east, its workers recruited and then simply taken, which meant the bill for the German war could be handed to people who weren't German. The full version had a face anyway, and it wasn't Germany's. In the Soviet Union in 1942, civilian consumption was cut to less than 40% of the entire economy. City rations sat at starvation levels, and urban mortality climbed. That is what the word fully costs. Would Germans have endured it in 1939? Probably. The same population later obeyed through firebombing, defeat and occupation without a single serious revolt. But Hitler couldn't see our hindsight. He was governing by the ghost of 1918, and that ghost priced every setting on this lever higher than he was willing to pay. Which leaves one last piece standing. If Germany was already this deep in, what exactly happened in 1942? Speer took over armaments production in February 1942. Within a year, the output charts carried his name. Those charts came from his own ministry, and his ministry drew the starting line at the worst months German industry had posted in years, the exact months he walked in. Everything after that looked like resurrection. He wasn't inventing the output. The tanks were real. He was choosing the floor they got measured from. 60 years later, 3 German economic historians went looking for the real curve. They found it in the confidential audits of 7 aircraft firms, the numbers a company writes down when the taxman is the audience and not the Führer. The curve was already climbing before Albert Speer arrived. It had been climbing for years because the plants ordered before the war were finally finished, the contracts had been rewritten to punish waste, and the men on the line were building their 4th straight year of the same aircraft. Nobody has to be a genius for that. Somebody just has to wait. And one input no chart in that ministry measured honestly. By September 1944, 6 million foreign civilians were working inside Germany alongside prisoners of war and camp prisoners pulled into the same factories. Speer didn't inherit an economy. He inherited one that could go out and take its workers. So the investment this counterfactual asks for, Germany already made. You are living in the timeline where it paid out, which is what the man in the castle was selling. A Germany that slept until 42 needed a genius to wake it, and a genius who merely built weapons might be something less than a war criminal. They convicted him over the labor system he ran and gave him 20 years. The rest is still out there, still working. Except one thread survives even the audits, the fleet Germany's own admirals begged for and never got. On the first day of the war, Karl Dönitz put a number in a memorandum. 300 U-boats, 100 at sea, 100 in transit, 100 refitting and training. He had 57, and 26 could reach the Atlantic. The yards were busy with something else. Plan Z, battleships and aircraft carriers on a schedule that finished in 1948, as if the war would wait its turn. Bismarck and Tirpitz came out of that program, one hid in a Norwegian fjord for most of the war. The other lasted 9 days at sea. Cancelling them doesn't hand you submarines. Different yards, different machinery, different crews, and about 2 years from the order to the Atlantic, but moved the naval budget in 1936 instead of 1939, and Germany starts this war with substantially more boats. And it costs the German kitchen table nothing at all. Which matters because of what the few he had already did. In the autumn of 1940, Dönitz's handful were sinking British ships faster than British yards could replace them. The crews called it the happy time. Escorts were scarce. The countermeasures that later broke the U-boat war didn't exist yet. Scale that autumn up, and you are in the one version of this scenario where serious historians allow that Britain might have been squeezed toward the table before American power reached the ocean. Then weigh the other side. German torpedoes were failing to detonate, and Britain gets a vote. More escorts, more patrol aircraft, better convoys, all of it built in the years Germany spent building. Dönitz's arithmetic assumed an enemy who stood still. So Germany didn't sleep until Speer woke it. It went in deeper than anyone, and what it had left was smaller than the scenario imagines and dearer than the scenario ever pays. Speer needed the other story to survive his trial. The Allies needed it too. 6 years of world war against one mid-sized country reads better against a machine that woke up late. A myth with 2 motivated authors is the hardest kind to kill. So Germany mobilizes fully in 1939. Does that change how the war ends? Or only how long it takes? Let me know in the comments. If this shifted how you picture the German war machine, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.